Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirikoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my must-own breakout players for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about 5 players in specific who are either going into their second or third years in the National Football League and have the potential to have a breakout season. I'll talk about my perspective and opinions and the statistics that justify my thought process as we approach our 2021 fantasy football drafts. For many of us, you'll have the potential to draft these players, and if in fact you end up pulling the trigger, they could end up having themselves fantastic years and establishing themselves despite having all of the intricacies of their past, whether it has been injuries that have plagued them or opportunity that hasn't been there but now is going to be presented in 2021. Of course, we'll cover all of that on today's episode, but before we begin, I of course want to thank you guys for the incredible support as of late. We just recently surpassed 41,000 subscribers, which again is another great accomplishment, but our destination and what we look forward to is of course trying to accomplish the 50,000 subscriber mark. But again, though the destination is ahead of us, it's all about the journey and how we get there and how the 2021 fantasy football season is going to go. So if you want to join us throughout the journey, subscribe to the channel because we're going to be making content for the entirety of the 2021 season, beginning Monday through Friday, of course, of this upcoming week. We're going to be doing running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end rankings for week 1 of the 2021 fantasy football season, making sure your lineups are ready to go. Sunday morning live streams, waiver wires on a weekly basis, hidden gems for every single given week, talking about matchups, all of that to make sure that you are in the right spot to not only win your weekly matchups, but to capture a 2021 fantasy football championship. So subscribe down below. Again, I cannot thank you guys enough. I do really appreciate it. The last thing that I wanted to mention before we begin today's video is that yes, my 2021 fantasy football draft guide is now available for those of you who are either drafting later today or tomorrow. Make sure you go ahead, go down to the description of the video and pick that up. I really do appreciate it. Again, while you're still down there, you can either click that bell notification button, click the subscribe button, and again, if you want to continue to support the channel, click that like button on today's video. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is to the growth of this channel. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about some breakout running backs. Now, I know you may be looking at Clyde Edwards-Helaire on screen and thinking to yourself, Andrew, is he really a breakout running back? Well, of course, going into year 2, in comparison to the hype that we saw last offseason, again, I was one of the people last season that was saying Clyde Edwards should be going in the back end of the first round based on the offense, the opportunities that the Kansas City Chiefs saw or were going to continue to give running backs. Damian Williams, of course, opting out of the 2020 season. Everything prepared to kind of go in the direction of Clyde Edwards-Helaire coming off of course, a very successful career at LSU and potentially hop right into the NFL and make an immediate impact in terms of the entire fantasy landscape. And in my opinion, he absolutely did so. But a lot of people look at Clyde Edwards-Helaire and kind of shun him away because of the recency bias of what he most recently did for many fantasy managers, which again was out of his control. When we look at what exactly Clyde Edwards-Helaire was capable of accomplishing in his 2020 rookie season with the Kansas City Chiefs, it's apparent that right off the rip, beginning of the season, he was the workhorse running back of this team. And I know a lot of people look at Clyde Edwards-Helaire and think he's a smaller stature running back, he's more of a pass catcher. My goodness, they were giving him the ball a lot on the ground and they weren't stopping because they were continuing to find success there regardless of who was of course at quarterback. I know Patrick Mahomes in this offense with Kelsey and Hill are a very pass heavy team, but they of course need to establish the run. That is a must for every single offense that wants to find success in the National Football League. So from weeks 1 through 6 of the 2020 season, he averaged 21.33 touches per game and 14.12 fantasy points per game while only scoring 1 touchdown. And that touchdown only came in the first game of the season against the Houston Texans. So putting that into perspective, a lot of his statistics came from yards, whether it was on the ground, through the air, and of course receptions. Throughout the first 6 games of the season, he had a total of 31 targets, which is a 5 target per game average, which helped Clyde Edwards-Helaire maintain his RB1 status. In fact, from weeks 1 through 6, he was the number 11 overall running back in a half PPR scoring format, even in a full PPR scoring format, because again, the amount of targets that he was getting, the opportunity that was consistently there was leading to his success. And you may be thinking, okay, well, he was a top 12 back for the first 6 games of the season. Andrew, where did it all go wrong? It all went wrong when the Kansas City Chiefs thought it was a good idea to bring in Le'Veon Bell. And though they had no real reason to have to bring him in, of course, they were looking for a championship run, any other, sort of advantage they can gather, whether it is an aging running back that is probably on the last legs of his, overall career. As long as he can come in and give a boost, that's what they wanted. Unfortunately, it didn't really pan out well for Le'Veon Bell, but ultimately, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was still able to fight through splitting snaps with Le'Veon Bell and found a lot of success. In fact, from weeks 7 through 14, he averaged 12.33 touches per game. Again, that's a significant drop, but again, splitting snaps, and 11.92 fantasy points per game. And of course, his touchdown total went up to 4 instead of the in comparison 1 from the early half of the season. He had 21 targets throughout that time, which is 3.5 targets per game, and was the number 25 overall running back. So of course, there's a disparity between full backfield dedicated to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and in the opposite, which of course was Le'Veon Bell's presence taking away touches, targets, and touchdowns, which of course diminished the overall value of Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and for many of us left a bad taste in our mouths. Now, unfortunately, after week 14 in the week 15 matchup against the New Orleans Saints, Clyde Edwards-Helaire did sustain an injury, which pretty much knocked him out for the rest of the season, and many of us fantasy managers, of course, felt the pain of that because you invested potentially a late first round pick into the hype of Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but you did not recoup the value in which you spent in that first round. Now, of course, this upcoming season, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is not a first round, value pick. In fact, I've often seen him go at the back end of the second round and oftentimes maybe even drop into the third round because there are some times that a lot of teams just look at Clyde Edwards, they understand what he was accomplishing and think to themselves, is he really going to get that many opportunities in a team like the Kansas City Chiefs, which of course is going to dedicate a lot of their opportunity to Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill. But regardless of that, we saw from weeks 1 through 6 of last season, 21.33 touches per game. That is a bunch of opportunity, especially for a running back that was going into a rookie year, which again, didn't have an offseason. There was a lot of rookies last season that struggled mightily because they weren't able to transition to the full speed of the National Football League, and they weren't able to find success. And though there were some, like a Justin Jefferson, that were able to find immediate success, there were often guys like a DeAndre Swift or a J.K. Dobbins or a Cam Akers that had to find their footing late in the season. And to be honest, Clyde Edwards, he found his footing early, but unfortunately was hamstrung by the fact that Le'Veon Bell and his injury both tag teamed and took him out for the back end of the season. But going into the 2020 season, like I mentioned, when you can draft him in a far more discounted price in comparison to the 2020 season, and we already know this offensive line is extremely improved. They replaced literally all 5 players up front. They, of course, traded for a left tackle, former right tackle of the Baltimore Ravens. They brought him in. He's, of course, a great run blocker. And then you continue to solidify the rest of your roles with either rookies that you either drafted or guys that have been veterans in the National Football League that can certainly immediately fill in, find chemistry with one another, and be able to solidify an offense that, of course, needs a stable offensive line to find some consistency there. But on top of that, this is not just a running back. If I was talking about Gus Edwards, okay, Gus Edwards might have some opportunity here and there, but he is a receiving back. There's the dynamic nature of being able to catch the ball. I mean, in 8 of his games last season, he caught the ball 3 or more times. If he's going to see the third most opportunities in the passing game on this team, like I expect him to do, because again, Travis Kelce's number 1, Tyreek Hill's number 2, and typically when you have a number 1-2 combo that consists of a tight end, your number 3 wide receiver, whether it is Mecole Hardman, is probably not going to see that many opportunities. Again, I think Mecole Hardman's only had a handful of games over 4 receptions in his career. I don't think that number is going to increase that much. I think Clyde Edwards is going to see a far greater receiving role this upcoming season out of the backfield. And not to mention, in terms of the Kansas City Chiefs, they have the 8th easiest strength of schedule at the running back position this season. Again, if you haven't seen my strength of schedule video, that's down in the description for those of you who are interested. Outside of that, I think Clyde Edwards has the huge opportunity this upcoming season. And I know this offseason, he has been dealing with an ankle injury. He'll be good to go week 1. And I think he's going to be ready to prove that against Cleveland and absolutely become a breakout this upcoming year. The next breakout candidate that I wanted to mention is Jalen Hurts going into his second year. I talk about second-year quarterbacks a lot because there's always, over the last, I want to say maybe 5+ seasons, there's always a quarterback that in their second year has an explosive performance. And last year, it really was Kyler Murray. This year, I mean, a lot of people are looking towards Herbert to take the next step forward. But besides, of course, Herbert, because I'm all in on that train, I really do think there is a potential for Jalen Hurts to very easily become a QB1 in 2021. And there's a reason why I have him ranked in that range, because what we've seen from him thus far and the opportunities that he's going to have in 2021 presents a beautiful combination for a 4-point per passing touchdown quarterback that, of course, is going to solidify a majority of his value on the ground, but is going to look a lot more like Lamar Jackson than a lot of other people think. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about what Jalen Hurts has accomplished in his career and what gives me the confidence based on his statistics to go ahead and potentially invest in him this year and rely upon him to carry my team in specific circumstances. Now, of course, in a 1 QB league, you can wait for a quarterback, and that's what I'm kind of suggesting you do if you are going for a Jalen Hurts. If you get to a position in which, of course, the value for other positions, running back, wide receiver, or tight end, are far too valuable to give up in that specific circumstance, then go ahead and wait on a quarterback. You can even get a guy like Ryan Tannehill, but Jalen Hurts even farther down the board and potentially get yourself a QB1 that ultimately will be the biggest investment of your season, because if in fact you can get a quarterback like this in the 8th round, that's gold. Because in comparison to a lot of other teams who are taking quarterback in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, you could potentially wait and continue to solidify your overall structure of your team in those rounds. Now, of course, statistically, last season he started 4 games. In the 4 starts, he averaged 23.74 fantasy points per game. Now, if we want to broaden the scope and pretty much look at exactly when Jalen Hurts played, there was prior to, of course, his first start as the Eagles starting quarterback. He did come in during the 4th quarter of that Green Bay Packers game. And in fact, even in the final game of the season against the Washington football team, he was pulled early for Nate Sudfeld because, again, the coaching staff wasn't pulling. I don't know, man. I can't understand what the heck Doug Peterson was thinking last year. Regardless, all in all, in terms of game clock, he comprehensively played pretty much 4.125 overall games, and throughout that time, it was averaging about 25.51 fantasy points per game. So, of course, when he's on the field, he's a difference maker and he's scoring. And how was he able to accomplish that, especially with an Eagles offense that was, putrid last year, really wasn't able to do anything with Carson Wentz. Maybe it was Carson Wentz's fault, but otherwise, Jalen Hurts was able to come in and make a lot of success happen very quickly, regardless of what was surrounding him. A majority of that, of course, was accomplished on the ground. 46 rushing attempts in his 4 starts for 272 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns. That's 68 rushing yards per game. Now, the last time we talked about a running back averaging 68 to 78 rushing yards per game was, in fact, Lamar Jackson after his rookie season. At the back end of the year, weeks 11 through 17, the guy was averaging about 78 yards per game. And in that offseason, I had enough confidence to say Lamar's probably going to run over 1,000 yards in this upcoming season. And that's just going to give him enough value to be a QB1, of course. Now, this upcoming year, when we see Jalen Hurts and what he's already been able to present, I think there's a potential for him to get to that 1,000 yard spot. But I don't think he gets there. I think 800 is an honest position if he's playing the entire year. There's no injuries and or replacements taking place or trades for the Deshaun Watson-esque character. So if in fact Jalen Hurts takes it upon himself to run the ball 150 times, maybe 140 to 150 times this upcoming season, I think 800 yards is very capable. On top of that, when you're running the ball that much, you're going to be a threat down on the goal line, of course, in any circumstance, and you're probably going to score 6, 7, potentially 8 rushing touchdowns. That value alone is going to be able to solidify his base. But again, when I talk about 800 yards, that's not that much in comparison to, Kyler Murray was able to accomplish that last year, and he really didn't even run the ball that much in the second half of the year. We, of course, have even seen Josh Allen run for 631 rushing yards in a season in which it was his rookie year, and he really wasn't even playing the full season because, again, he came back from the elbow surgery that he had during season. But again, we've seen a lot of quarterbacks get a high number of yardage, and I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for Jalen Hurts to accomplish it. In college, his final year at Oklahoma, had himself 1,298 rushing yards and 20 rushing touchdowns. I think it's there. The base value is there. So now let's talk about what he's capable of doing in the passing game. Of course, he has a significantly better offensive line this year than in the 4 starts that he had last year. Of course, they brought back Kelsey. Jason Kelsey is one of the best centers in the National Football League. You get Brandon Brooks back, all-pro right guard, all-pro right tackle. Lane Johnson returns. Andre Dillard, the left tackle they drafted a couple years ago in the first round, he returns. Their left guard has pretty much been a staple there, has been able to stay healthy. They've got a significantly improved offensive line, and though they are getting older, it is going to make a huge difference in terms of the passing game and, of course, in the running game, if in fact there are designed runs for him. Again, there's a lot of QB counters, QB powers that the Baltimore Ravens utilize, of course, injecting the college football game and those kind of running schemes into their respective offense. I wouldn't put it past the Philadelphia Eagles to go into the film room and, of course, watch exactly what the Baltimore Ravens were putting together and trying to emulate something similar to that for their quarterback. Now, besides the offensive line, they went ahead and they did improve the receivers there. The receivers have been a problem for the Philadelphia Eagles for the last couple of years. Let's not forget, they drafted a guy like J.J. Arcega-Whiteside over DK Metcalf a couple years back. They did draft Jalen Reagor ahead of Justin Jefferson last season. The Eagles, of course, with the mistakes that they've made in the past, went ahead and they did invest in another wide receiver in the early rounds. In fact, a first-round wide receiver by the name of Devontae Smith out of Alabama. Of course, the Heisman-winning wide receiver there. But yes, he'll make an immediate impact. Of course, he needs to stay healthy and he needs to stay on the field to do so. But outside of Devontae Smith, I think the only other options that we have to see a lot of success from is Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz, because those are the two security blankets for Jalen Hurts. Of course, in the preseason games that we've seen recently, of course, he's looking in their direction. They're running a lot of 2 tight end sets, and I guess that's just what they're going to have to do. They're going to have to find success with the tight end position. I don't put it past them to be able to do so. I just think, of course, the wide receiver position isn't built to a level in which, of course, he's going to be able to air it out for a bunch of yards or a bunch of touchdowns. I would say that at a very safe pace, he throws for 3,000 yards and maybe 20 touchdowns. And at that point, if you're going to accompany that along with the rushing totals, I think the math checks out, and we could end up seeing Jalen Hurts as a top 12 overall fantasy quarterback. And this is, again, these are the baseline. I'm reducing the yardage count. I'm reducing the overall production in the passing game because, again, he is inexperienced to an extent. But regardless, he's the 8th easiest matchups amongst all quarterbacks this upcoming season. Starts week 1 against the Atlanta Falcons, which in my opinion should be an easier run. We'll, of course, know by then what we're looking at and what we're experiencing. But I think, again, if you want to wait on quarterback, Jalen Hurts could be that potential breakout year 2 quarterback this upcoming season. All right, we're moving on to another player that, again, I've talked about a lot this season. But if you haven't heard me talk about it, I have to make my final point. Again, Diontae Johnson is one of my, if not my favorite wide receiver at the value that he's going for going into the 2021 fantasy football season. A lot of people look at Diontae Johnson going into his 3rd season and think, he's a guy that drops the ball too much. He's not a dependable enough wide receiver. They've got Claypool, they've got Juju, they've got Najee, they've got Eric Ebron. They're not going to be able to feed him the ball. But I mean, what are we talking about? These arguments are unfounded and they are not backed by any solidified statistics. Yes, the guy dropped the ball more than anybody in the National Football League last year. But to just go ahead and eliminate that from all of our minds, let's talk about who has dropped the ball for the last 2 seasons the most in the National Football League in terms of receptions being dropped. Okay, let's go ahead and think about this. Of course, Diontae Johnson is amongst the top, but he's not the top 3. Even though in the last 2 seasons, he's, of course, seen over 250 targets. But let's go ahead and let's talk about who has actually dropped the ball more than Diontae Johnson. DK Metcalf, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs. But nobody wants to mention that. Nobody wants to talk about that. You know who has a higher drop percentage than Diontae Johnson based on targets? A.J. Brown, DJ Moore. But nobody wants to talk about that because we think that the narrative of feeding into, Diontae Johnson drops balls is a smart one. It's not smart. It's, in fact, the absolute opposite. What you're doing is by looking at one game in which he played against the Buffalo Bills on Monday night and thinking, he dropped too many passes, he dropped a touchdown, this, that. That has continued to spiral out of control and lead to Diontae Johnson being drafted as like the number 25 wide receiver off the board, which is disgusting to me. You know how many times I've drafted him this year because of how cheap he has become? I mean, the amount of value that he has, I'm about to explain to you why exactly. The amount of value he has is unbelievable. I understand he dealt with a lot of injuries last year. He played 12 games, okay? Let's talk about the 12 games in which he actually played. He averaged 14.05 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Now, if we go ahead and isolate the games in which Diontae Johnson played with Ben Roethlisberger, because again, that is going to be a starting quarterback this year, and I'm not really worried about the game in which he played with Mason Rudolph in week 17 of last season. So let's look at the games in which during the regular season and in the playoffs he played with Ben Roethlisberger. In 11 of those games, 10 of them accounted for double-digit targets. Can you imagine that? Double-digit targets in 11 of the 13 games he played overall last year with Ben Roethlisberger. Great numbers. Again, in those games, he averaged 15.96 fantasy points per game. Amongst all wide receivers last season, during the regular year, there were only 2 other wide receivers outside of Diontae Johnson that had 10 games of 10-plus targets. That was Keenan Allen and Devontae Adams. That's incredible company to be beside because, again, we're talking about the elite of the elite in terms of pass catchers. Now, okay, yes, he drops the ball. This is beginning to start to fade away, isn't it now? Because the targets are going to be there. Again, I talk about it all the time. Targets are not by accident. You get open, therefore the target is there. If in fact Diontae Johnson wasn't open, wasn't able to find separation, wasn't a good enough route runner in the National Football League, of course he wouldn't be able to get open, but he is at the level of a Keenan Allen, Devontae Adams, and though he is continuing to get better and better because he is only going into his third year, he's going to continue to find progression and even be a better wide receiver this upcoming year. Now, of course, let's look at what he was able to do in the games that he was healthy. In the games he was healthy, he ran 542 total routes. He was targeted 153 times last year. That's a 28.23% target percentage from routes run to total targets. In comparison to the other wide receivers in this offense, Chase Claypool had a 21.97% target percentage, and Juju Smith-Schuster 18.66% target percentage. Now, of course, the argument can be made, yeah, Juju out-targeted Diontae Johnson, but Juju played more games. Of course, Chase Claypool could go into his second year and improve, but this is a team that runs 3 wide receiver sets more than just about anybody in the National Football League. They're in top 3 in terms of overall percentage of snaps offensively with 3 wide receivers on the field, 80+% of the time in 2020, and potentially that number could decrease. You know, you bring in, of course, Najee Harris, you bring in another tight end like Pat Freiermuth. Of course, you're going to have the opportunity to go to 2 wide receiver sets. But when you go into 2 wide receiver sets, you know what the Pittsburgh Steelers do? They put Juju on the field and they put Diontae on the field, and Chase Claypool's gone. Diontae is going to stay on the field regardless of what the formation is. He is going to be a huge part of this offense. Again, getting 153 targets last year and only playing a very minimal amount of games. Again, left a lot of games with injury, dropped a bunch of passes. If these things improve, imagine the sky's the limit. Now, when we think about what he can do better than anybody, sure, it's the routes run and the targets and getting the receptions in a PPR format, and maybe his touchdown upside isn't that great, but in comparison to Claypool, in terms of red zone target share, you know, last season, Diontae Johnson had 11 red zone targets, leading to, you know, overall 4 touchdowns in 12 games. Chase Claypool, 13 red zone targets for 4 touchdowns in 14 games. They're on a very similar basis, and I think they're going to continue to improve together. But Diontae Johnson, a huge part of this offense going into 2021. Do not look past him when he's on the board and you are in those later rounds. And again, he is being taken in the wide receiver 20 to 25 range. It's crazy to me. The next wide receiver I want to talk about today is Brandon Aiyuk, another guy that I've been banging the drum for this offseason. Finishing as the number 33 wide receiver last year. May not seem like the greatest overall numbers in terms of statistics, but Brandon Aiyuk fought through adversity and was an incredible overall wide receiver prospect last season. And for many of us, helped us get to the fantasy football playoffs because of the contributions he made between week 7 through 16 of the season. In the 7 games that he played throughout that span, he was averaging 15.15 fantasy points per game. In 6 of those contests, he surpassed 70 receiving yards, and in 4 of those contests had at least 1 receiving touchdown minimum. Again, throughout that time, he was the number 21 overall wide receiver because he played significantly less games. Again, only 7 games throughout that 8 to 9 week stretch. But on top of it, if we go ahead and just isolate the fantasy point per game productivity of him, he was the number 7 overall wide receiver. A lot of people look at the San Francisco 49ers offense this year and they think to themselves, well, is it going to be Trey Lance? Is it going to be Jimmy Garoppolo? But I'm not really worried about that. The question that I continue to ask myself is whether or not it's Deebo Samuel or Brandon Aiyuk. And I've come to the conclusion that it's going to be Brandon Aiyuk. Again, throughout the beginning of the season, considering he was a rookie last year, it took a while for him to find his footing. And Deebo Samuel being injured for the first 3 games of the year because of the offseason foot injury he had. Of course, they came back, and from weeks 4, 5, 6, 7, and 13, they both played together on the same time on the field because, again, Deebo Samuel missed a lot of time due to injury, and Brandon Aiyuk missed his fair share of games because, again, he was dealing with a couple things. But in the games that they played together last year, the 5 different contests, Brandon Aiyuk had 30 targets, Deebo Samuel had 31. That's perfectly fine considering, again, Deebo Samuel has a rapport with these quarterbacks that they played with, and Brandon Aiyuk was just a rookie coming off of an offseason, which, of course, he himself was missing a bunch of games and trying to find himself a footing in the National Football League. Now, throughout this span of time, of course, Deebo Samuel was getting outscored on a weekly basis, only scoring 8.9 fantasy points per game in comparison to Brandon Aiyuk's 11.84 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Again, this is all in consideration with, yes, it was with Jimmy G at times, but it was a lot of Nick Mullins and CJ Beathard who aren't the greatest quarterbacks. They are career backups, and that's how they'll be. I think CJ Beathard is playing behind Trevor Lawrence this upcoming season. I don't even know where Nick Mullins went. But either way, going into the 2021 season, of course, Brandon Aiyuk had to find a lot of his productivity with a rotation of quarterbacks, while also having to be the number one receiving option for this offense. At times, there were games there was no Deebo Samuel and there was no George Kittle. And Brandon Aiyuk had to fight through adversity there as well. The fact that you were the number one receiving option, defensive coordinators every single week were thinking, okay, that's their best option. Let's double cover him. Yeah, the 49ers can run the ball, but we can go ahead and deal with that with 8 guys in the box and just cover Brandon Aiyuk. That's all they had to do, but they still weren't able to accomplish that, like I've mentioned before with the stats that I mentioned. He was the number 7 overall wide receiver when he was given those full opportunities, and he was on his way to potentially becoming, a top 24 wide receiver last year until, of course, the injury knocked him out of the running. Overall, I think Brandon Aiyuk is a very interesting investment. He's a wide receiver that's going in that wide receiver 20 range, similar to Diontae Johnson. But to be honest, when we look at this offense, of course, George Kittle is going to be the number one, overall receiving option, potentially in targets. But I think Brandon Aiyuk is going to take that number 2 spot because when we look at Deebo Samuel, his usage, he's only had an average depth of target over the last couple of years of 2.2 yards in comparison to, of course, Brandon Aiyuk having a 9.9 average depth of target last season in his rookie year. They want him to be the number 1 outside receiver. That's what they brought him in to do, and that's why they invested such a high draft pick to bring him into the San Francisco 49ers offense. Of course, he himself will still run the ball, had himself 77 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns last year. I think he continues to expand upon that, becomes a huge breakout wide receiver in year 2. The last option I wanted to mention, another player I really like this offseason, but a lot of people have kind of gotten cold feet surrounding, is Darrell Henderson. I understand it. I get it. Sony Michel is coming into the Los Angeles Rams organization, and that scares you. But let's be honest, Sony Michel didn't scare us with Damian Harris, even though that backfield over there in New England has been far more of a running back by committee in the history of their team and what Josh McDaniels has wanted to do in comparison to what Sean McVay has done in his time with the Los Angeles Rams. Again, we've seen year over year in which Todd Gurley was given unimpeded opportunity of play on a consistent basis. And though last year we saw a little bit of a committee to begin with, they eventually found their RB1 because they went and drafted Cam Akers as early as they did to become the RB1 of this team. And though it took them some time to get there, Cam Akers was a rookie last year. Of course, it took him some time. But now that we go into the 2021 season and Cam Akers is gone, Darrell Henderson is going to be the lead back for this team. He has been that lead back for the entire offseason. And the main reason they brought in Sony Michel this offseason was, of course, because either the New England Patriots were going to trade him, so they put him on the trade block because Damian Harris, Ramondre Stevenson, they already had that job. They were already whispers last year of Sony Michel getting cut from that team. So, of course, the Los Angeles Rams think to themselves, who do we have? We have Jake Funk. We have Xavier Jones. Both those guys cannot work. They're both getting injured. Boom, gone. We need a second-string running back. Let's bring in Sony Michel. And that's what they did. They need a second-string running back. And when we weren't worried about him last week with Damian Harris, why are we worried now in regards to Darrell Henderson? Because, again, what we've seen from Darrell Henderson is that he is one of the more talented running backs in the National Football League in terms of what he does best. He is a speed runner. Yes, he's not a guy that's going to make you miss. He is going to be a guy that is going to burn you if he finds his lane. And that's what he's been able to do, whether it's back in college or in the National Football League. And we can just go back to last season from weeks 2 through 7 of the 2020 season when he was given the RB1 opportunity of the Los Angeles Rams. In 5 of those games, he had 14 plus touches and was averaging 15.14 fantasy points per game. Also, throughout that span of time, weeks 2 through 7, was the number 13 overall running back in fantasy football in a half PPR scoring format. And again, like I've mentioned, unfortunately, Darrell Henderson last year dealt with an injury. Of course, we had Malcolm Brown rotating throughout that time as well. Cam Akers was also rotating. And eventually, the job went to Cam Akers. That's fine. But what did they do when they finally gave the job to Cam Akers? They gave him everything, literally all the opportunity in the world. And that's what they want to do with their running backs. They've shown that year over year. Again, in the 6 games that Cam Akers was a starter from weeks 3 through the entirety of the NFL playoffs, the guy was averaging 15.38 fantasy points per game, 23.83 attempts per game. Attempts, not just touches, attempts per game. 118 yards per game, a 4.25 yard per carry average, and half a touchdown per game. When we talk about touchdowns in the Rams, when we talk about opportunities in the Rams, the running back position is going to feast regardless of who it is, and that's why I continue to bang the drum for Darrell Henderson. When we talk about what they've done in terms of attempts, in 2 out of the last 3 seasons, the Los Angeles Rams have been in the top 7 in total running back attempts. In terms of targets, the Los Angeles Rams have been in the top 23 in 2 out of the last 3 seasons. And though we've seen a little bit of a dip, that's still 97 targets and 71 total targets. In 2 out of the last 3 seasons, the Rams have also been top 12 in overall running back opportunity. And in terms of touchdowns, In the last 3 seasons combined, they're the number 3 overall team in terms of running back touchdowns with 57 total. Again, a lot of this was accompanied to and given to Todd Gurley. But of course, Todd Gurley fell apart, and in 2019 was a shell of himself, and that's why they dipped him and got away from him in 2020. But going into the 2021 season, you do have a very talented backfield here with Darrell Henderson. You have an offense that needs to run the ball and has a great offensive line. You just have to give this man opportunity. He's been able to deliver on it year over year when given said opportunity, and regardless of who's even started in this backfield, because last year there were games in which Akers started 6 games, like I mentioned. Henderson started 5 games. Malcolm Brown started 5 games. Regardless of who is the starting running back in this backfield, they're averaging 13.55 fantasy points per game, as long as they were the starter alone. Forget, of course, there were still other guys behind them taking touches, taking targets. So regardless of what Sony Michel does, I think Darrell Henderson is going to be a great option. His value has dropped. He's almost outside of the top 25. And I think at that range, I'm more than happy investing in him in comparison to grabbing potentially guys like Melvin Gordon, who may end up losing their jobs in just a couple weeks, maybe even week 1. You never know. Either way, these are the 5 prospects that I wanted to mention in regards to players that have the potential for a breakout season in 2021. I want to thank you guys for watching. Thank you for spending your time and supporting the channel here today. I do appreciate it. Again, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Click that like button down below. Go down to the description of the video if you're looking for my 2021 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. We also have a free Discord server down there for those of you interested. Until tomorrow, which we'll be talking about my bold predictions for the 2021 Fantasy Football season. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you guys. Peace.